Public Library in Sedona, Arizona. Today, September 5th, 2007, it is my pleasure and privilege to present Leo Agers, a World War II veteran. I would like to mention that Leo and Carol Agers donated money for the building of this library, and Carol's name appears on the plaque outside the front door. Leo, you were with 3 different units. What were they?
The first outfit was the Company K, 131st Infantry of the 33rd Division, which is a Chicago National Guard outfit. The second outfit I was with was the 43rd Materiel Squadron, and the third one was the U.S. Army Engineers, and the last one was the AACS, which was the Army Airways Communication System. And they served the Air Transport Command, which worldwide flew airplanes and airports to haul important people, but not military aircraft.
And what was the highest rank you received?
I was made Staff Sergeant twice. I was, after the first, I took a reduction in rank to get out of the infantry and go to the Air Corps. And then when I joined the engineers, I was made Staff Sergeant again.
And what were your years of service?
I was inducted at Fort Sheridan in Chicago, April 19th, 1941, and I was discharged at Camp Atterbury, Indiana on September 11, 1945.
Okay. I forgot something that needs to be inserted here at the very beginning. I forgot to introduce myself and our camera person. So I'm Judy Friel, the interviewer, and our camera person is Laura Bojanowski. So now Leo is going to tell us about his years of service, and then he's going to show us slides of his time in Australia. So Leo, take it away.
Thank you. I'm flattered and honored to be asked to contribute to the Veterans History Project. And I understand that copies of some memoirs I wrote years ago on this subject will be furnished along with this video. And I suppose I should give some vital statistics. I was, first I want to make a disclaimer that there's probably errors, omissions, and so on in the memoirs as well as my testimony today, and that those items are due to old age or failing memory, and the omissions are to protect the innocent or the guilty, as the case may be. I was born in Johnson County, Illinois, Southern Illinois, on October 26, 1918. I went through grade school in Williamson County, and I went through high school at Mount Carmel in Wabash County on the Wabash River between Illinois and Indiana. graduated from high school in May of 1935. And before and after getting out of high school, I had a number of jobs, a lot of different jobs. But the three most important ones were, I worked for the Kroger Company, which today is the world's largest grocery company. I ran the meat market for them in one of their stores in Southern Illinois, which will show up later in some of my testimony. I worked for Motorola building radios in their plant in Chicago. I was a supervisor on an assembly line with about 15 girls putting in a few parts of each radio. And I left Motorola because I was a supervisor for the line, but I didn't like that factory work because in a factory you're either a slave or a slave driver. I didn't want to be either one. The other company I worked for, which will be mentioned later, was National Tank Company, a company headquartered in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they made a lot of oil field equipment like bolted steel tanks, oil and gas separators, and so on. When, I don't know when the Selective Service Act was passed, but I'll guess 1940. And when I registered as my home address being Mount Carmel, although I worked various places around Illinois. And so when I was called up from Mount Carmel. And the National Tank was the company I was working for at that time, and they agreed to, voluntarily agreed to pay the difference between my salary with them, which as I recall was about $140 a month, and the difference between that and the Army pay, which for a private was $21 a month. So I believe I'll show you a list of the outfits, read a list of the outfits that I served in and the places where I was assigned, even sometimes for just a couple of days. The first one was Fort Sheridan, Chicago, where I was inducted. The next one was Camp Forest, Tennessee, where the company K-131st Infantry was based. The next area was Louisiana. The Louisiana maneuvers were carried on and carried out in Arkansas and Louisiana mainly, a little bit into Texas. Then I was in an Armistice Day parade in Chicago. I went to Marksfield, California, where I was stuck in the 43rd Materiel Squadron. The next place was Camp Darley at near Melbourne, Australia. And I went to Sydney, which were really Bankstown Aerodrome. The next was in the Northern Territory of Australia. I was, I guess I'll say, living at Adelaide River, but I also worked at Batchelor Field and some other P-40 fighter strips. From Adelaide River area, I went to Fenton Field, which is about 100 miles south of Darwin, in Australia, where we had a B-24 bomber base. We were finally relieved at Fenton and went to Amberley Field at Brisbane, Australia, for a rest. From there, I went to the Army Engineers in Milne Bay, New Guinea. From there, I went to Keesler Field, Biloxi, Mississippi. Biloxi is one of the Gulf Coast cities wiped out by the hurricane a couple of years ago. Then I stopped at the Fresno Air Base in California after that. I was assigned to the San Bernardino Air Base at Riverside, California. And then from there on the way to Europe, I was stopped for a few days or weeks at Selfridge Field, Michigan, Greensboro, North Carolina. They were both transient air bases. Selfridge was named for an Army engineer who went for a ride with Orville Wright, and they crashed the airplane. Orville was injured but not killed, but Selfridge was the first man ever killed in an airplane crash. From there, Greensboro, North Carolina, I went to Valley Air Base on the Isle of Anglesey in Wales in the British from there I came back to the States, went through Fort Dix, New Jersey, and to Camp Atterbury, Indiana, where I was discharged. I suppose I should show some of the arm, so-called shoulder patches that I wore during the war at all my various assignments. The Gold Cross was the emblem for the 33rd Division, and which, as I previously said, was a Chicago outfit. The two little lapel pins here are for the 131st Infantry, and the three white bars are for the three battles they were in World War I in France. And the badge on the shoulder patch on the upper right was for the Army Engineers. The one on the upper left was for the Air Training Command when I was at Biloxi. The lower left is the 5th Air Force that I was in Australia.
I'm getting a little bit of glare. Can you show the very last one more time? That one. Oh, lower left, sorry. Thank you.
Lower left. The lower right was the one I wore at San Bernardino Air Base, and the large one in the middle was the AACS arm patch. The bar in the middle reflects that I was in before the war. That's the pre-war defense medal on the left. and the Victory Medal on the extreme right. And in the middle of the ribbon is the one for the Southwest Pacific. And as it shows there, I got credit for 3 battle stars in Australia. The green one to the right of that is for the service in Europe. When I was called up for April of 41, I left Mount Carmel on a train, and there was several of us, probably a couple of dozen. There wasn't a single soul to see us off that I knew. And I think that was because people didn't expect us to get into the war. So when I reported it to Fort Sheridan, they gave us a whole bunch of tests, IQ tests, physicals, and I guess I'll say a psychiatrist test, because the guy questioning me got real huffy when I said I didn't appreciate Roosevelt setting up the draft so he could get us into the war in Europe. And the only amusing thing that happened at Fort Sheridan was, as soon as we were sworn in, so they could order us around, they ordered us to, there was probably a couple hundred, they ordered us to strip bare ass naked. And we lined up, and since my name started with A, I was about the 3rd one in line. Abernathy has always beat Agers. So, as they had nurses and doctors on each side, and as you moved along, they jabbed you with all kinds of shots. And just as my turn came, the guy in front of me fainted and fell down, so I had to stand around without any pants on until they dragged away the casualty. I went from Fort Sheridan, I went down to Camp Forrest in Tennessee, which is the nearest town is Tullahoma, and it's about Camp Forrest is about halfway between Nashville to the north and Chattanooga to the south. And at the time by the time I got there, there was about 75 or 80,000 men in the camp, and most of them were National Guard outfits. One outfit even still had horses, a cavalry outfit. And about a year before I was drafted, I had some trouble with my feet and ankles. So that when I woke up in the morning, they'd be swelled up big, and I could hardly walk. So I did not appreciate getting drafted into the infantry. And because my service, or my personnel record showed that I had worked running a butcher shop for Kroger, I very quickly got pushed into being the mess sergeant. The one I replaced was always drunk, and the cooks were terrible, untrained, and didn't want the job. So I went through all the personnel records of the Company K to find out somebody that might be a better cook. And I picked out 2 or 3 or 4, and one of them had owned, if he'd have been a month older, he wouldn't have been drafted. But he owned and operated a small specialty bakery in Belleville, Illinois. So I made him my first cook. And there was a number of things happened at Camp Forest, but nothing important. About the middle of July of 41, we went on the famous or infamous Louisiana maneuvers. And as mess sergeant, I had a weapons carrier truck, which is about I'd call it a half-ton truck vehicle, four-wheel drive. And it hauled our, we had 4 new gasoline stoves with 4 burners, and the ovens weren't worth a damn. And we carried a tent for the kitchen operations, but no tents for the guys to eat in. The first night out, we stopped at Fort Shiloh, which is about 50 miles east of Memphis, Tennessee, and it was on the Tennessee River where the Battle of Shiloh was fought. So we camped the first night in the Shiloh battlefield. I really explored the place because my grandfather, who came from Ireland to the U.S. before the Civil War and joined the cavalry as a way of getting citizenship, and he was in the cavalry at Shiloh during the battle. And I always said if the cavalry had done their job, Grant's army wouldn't have been surprised when Albert Sidney Johnston's Confederate army attacked them one Sunday morning. It was a big surprise. The battle lasted 2 days, and Grant won, and Albert Sidney Johnston was bled to death on the second day of the battle, and he was probably the best general the South had. And he had been the commander of the 2nd Dragoons, which was all the cavalry west of the Mississippi before the war started, and when my grandfather was under him. The casualties, that was the first big bloody battle of the Civil War. And each side lost about 2,000 killed and about 8,000 wounded. The rest of the maneuvers, we were trying to learn or use Hitler's blitzkrieg system of moving the troops 100 miles by truck one day and marching 10 or 20 miles the next day, and so forth. I can't remember all the places we stopped, but we camped out in the woods generally. I guess I'll say, well, we had a new commander, CO for the 131st. It was a major named, his last name is R-A-Y, Major Ray. And he and we explored a lot of places. Like one day we drove to Vicksburg, Mississippi to explore that battlefield ground. Battlefield was there, where Grant finally won by starving the Army and the civilians to death. I guess the most interesting thing that happened on the maneuvers was one day I drove into Manny, Louisiana. We were camped near there to buy something or other. And when I got back, my whole outfit was gone. Their tents were all there. There wasn't a single soul stirring. So I drove around and then found that the 7th Cavalry, which still had horses, plus a few lousy little tanks, they had captured my outfit. And they had trucked them down to near Lake Charles, Louisiana, where they slept out in the rain and ate sea rations for 3 days. And when they got back, Major Ray was very unhappy that I had it easy while they were suffering as prisoners of war. And the prisoners of war thing was just a ruling by the referees, or whatever you call them, that was running the maneuvers. And the outfit, that 7th Cavalry, was under some kind of a Texas outfit, and the general out of San Antonio that was running that side of the war, they were called the invading army. The army I was in was called the defending army, and the general of what I call the Texas Army was Walter Kruger, and his right-hand man was Eisenhower, Ike Eisenhower. And there isn't much doubt in my mind that the fact that they won the war, and Eisenhower was known to be a guy that took orders without question. He'd worked for MacArthur years before in the Philippines, and on those maneuvers he worked under Kruger. So when I found out my outfit was gone after a day or two, Kruger didn't see me, but I saw him talking to a bunch of officers. The next time I saw General Kruger was in New Guinea, when I was with the engineers. Among the other things we did on maneuvers, we were camped near Shreveport, and I went with Major Ray to watch a demonstration of bombing. And there were about 3 different types of planes there used. They were dropping 100-pound sandbags, and we sat on a like at a football game on stands. And one of the planes used, the first time I ever saw one, was a B-25 twin-engine bomber. And that was the type bomber that was used to take off carriers in the Pacific and bomb Tokyo early in the war. And later I have something else to say about B-25s at our bomber base in Australia. When we were getting ready to get off maneuvers, I had a call from the National Tank Company, the president of the company, which I knew, and he said they were going to carry out their promise to pay the difference between my salary and National Tank pay. And by the way, as mess sergeant, I was getting $72 a month. And so I said, "You mean you think war is going to start?" And he said, "You said it, I didn't." But he mentioned a number of other things that told me war was going to start. He mentioned that Roosevelt had stopped all shipments of petroleum, crude oil, scrap iron, everything else to Japan. He also pointed out that National Tank Company was under a war production board, and that they couldn't buy a gallon of aluminum paint or a pound of steel without the war production board approval. So immediately I decided the war was going to start. So as soon as we got back to Camp Forest, I put in motion all the things you have to do to get out of the infantry and into the Air Corps. While I was waiting to get transferred, we, the 131st Infantry, we went to Chicago by truck convoy, and for the Armistice Day Parade. And since I was mess sergeant, I could kind of do as I pleased. So I sat on the base of General Logan's statue in Grant Park while my regiment came marching down Michigan Boulevard. When the next thing worth mentioning is on December 6th, our regiment's colonel, commanding officer, Richmond, called me to his office and tried to talk me into staying with the infantry. He'd either make me a master sergeant or would send me to the officers' candidate school, which was a new thing the Army had started. But I decided that in a war, it would be better to be a hotshot pilot than a sergeant in the infantry. So it ended up, he signed my transfer on Saturday, December 6th, and guess what happened the next day? The Japs hit Pearl Harbor. So from Camp Forest, Tennessee, I drove my car. You weren't supposed to have a car or civilian clothes there, but I brought my 1940 Plymouth Coupe down from Illinois, and I kept it in my civilian clothes. And some kind folks had a two-car garage in Tullahoma, and one side was empty, so they let me keep my car in it. So I drove to Marchfield, California. And when I got there, I left my car in the parking lot, and I was never allowed back out the gate to go to the car, because since the war had started, there was all kinds of ridiculous rules, and I was treated like a prisoner of war. I couldn't go out the gate. I reported to the 32nd Base Headquarters Company, and my orders were to wait there until I was called to go to flying school, which was the Ryan Aircraft Company in San Diego. Ryan built the plane that Lindbergh flew to New York to Paris. At Marchfield, they told me I was in the 43rd Materiel Squadron. And it turned out that was a group of mechanics and repair people and other experts that repaired, maintained aircraft for, I'll call them fighting units. And we were, the 43rd was assigned to the 49th Fighter Group, which had P-40s. So after a couple of weeks or so at Marchfield, we got orders to ship out, and so we couldn't tell where we were going. We were told to pack wool uniforms, winter uniforms, as well as summer khakis. But I knew, I'd met friends with a guy at the headquarters, and he told me we were going to the Philippines. And he gave me a U.S. Geological Survey world map. And so we left Marchfield, went to San Francisco, and got on the SS Coolidge, which was a passenger ship before the war. And the 43rd with the 49th people and the 808 Army Engineer people on the President Coolidge, we went from San Francisco to Melbourne. Took 21 days. And we were escorted by the cruiser Phoenix, which during the Falkland War a few years ago, we sold it to Argentina and the British sunk it. As soon as I got off the boat at Melbourne, I made a phone call back to the States, and it took a handful of florins fed into the, and that was the last time anybody from the U.S. was able to make a phone call back to the States. So I went from Melbourne to Sydney in a little detail, and we went to Bankstown Aerodrome, which is an Aussie aerodrome near Botany Bay, where the first prisoners were settled and landed in Australia. While at Bankstown, I played golf a time or two, and one of the guys was a vice president of Armco Steel. They had a plant up at Newcastle in New South Wales in Australia. And when I was with National Tank, we bought nearly all our steel from Armco. So because I played golf, I met the president of the biggest bank in Australia, and when our guys, everybody in the 43rd came up to Brisbane, they hadn't been paid for a month or two, so I mentioned this to our CO, Major Culbertson, and he called my banking buddy friend, and he sent a team out, people with lots of money, and paid everybody in cash, or like me, they'd sent your money home through the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York. I toured Sydney because I didn't have anything else to do. The regular 43rd people were assembling the P-40s and getting them ready to fly in stages up to Darwin. While I was at Bankstown, I met a photographer with Australian magazine, which is like our Life magazine. So I got him to take a picture of some of us, and later my picture appeared in their Pix magazine, P-I-X. I made one trip back to Melbourne to pick up vehicles and stuff and bring them up to Bankstown. Then we were finally ordered to go to the Northern Territory. Most of our people went up to Brisbane, and then by hook and crook was ferried by different aircraft, up to the Northern Territory, up near Darwin. But I stayed behind with a small group to drive large, heavy vehicles, 18-wheelers, and we went to Melbourne to pick them up, and we drove them from Melbourne to, I'll say Darwin. And if I may, I'll show how we did it. Here's Melbourne, where we came in on the Coolidge. Here is Sydney, and up here is Brisbane. We went from Sydney to Melbourne and drove to Adelaide, and the road was paved in partly, but not very much. From Adelaide, we spent 3 or 4 days there, and I had to, while I was at Melbourne, I confiscated a Jeep, which I kept for 2 years. And so at Adelaide, I got my picture taken sitting in the Jeep out in front of my hotel. And Adelaide, that was the hottest day I've ever experienced. It was 120-some degrees. I had to wear gloves to hold the steering wheel when it sat in the sun. And I sat on the towels because it was too hot for otherwise. From Adelaide, we took a narrow gauge railway up through the heart of the country, about 1,000 miles, to Alice Springs in the Northern Territory. From Alice Springs, we drove to Darwin, which is up here. That trip was about, as I recall, we estimated and tried to keep track, but it was about 2,800 miles. Out in the middle of the desert on that narrow gauge, I bought a handful of rubies, or opals, handful of opals that had been mined at one of their famous opal mines called Coober Pedy. I later sold those opals, which looked like rough gravel with some glass showing. I sold them when I got back to San Francisco 2 or 3 years later. Since Darwin had been completely wiped out by the same Jap task force that hit Pearl Harbor, we stopped quite a bit south, 50 or 60 miles south. And the 808 engineers had already made several, I'll call them strips, for the P-40s to land on. And so we stopped at Adelaide River, and the 43rd did. And from there we serviced the 49th Fighter, which was 3 squadrons, 7, 8, and 9. And I ran the refueling, which was a odd job because 99% of the time you were sitting around and the other 1% was fueling the planes. But while we were at Adelaide River, I went on another convoy trip, went back to Brisbane and picked up a lot of trucks and stuff and drove them all the way back. And again, the road was non-existent a lot of the way it stretches. But with my Shell Oil Company map, which I picked up when we left Melbourne on the first convoy, we never got lost. And we ended up halfway there at a town called Mount Isa, which has got the world's largest lead mine. And from there it came a rain, which was the first rain it had in 7 years. So we stalled around a few days waiting for the mud to dry up because they were trying to build a road across the desert at that time, but some stretches we hadn't even started. So we stopped at a ranch in Australia. They call them stations, cattle stations. We stopped at a ranch, and our CO or our officer on the convoy, a guy named Wardle, he went riding on and picked a rank stallion, and when he came back, the stallion crashed into the gate and nearly killed Wardle, and he had a broken arm and a bad cut on his head and a few other things. So that we had to pick him up and put him in the vehicle for the next several days until we got him over to the north-south road where we had an airstrip at Daly Waters. They flew him back to Brisbane. The 49th Fighter Group, working from, I'll say, April to October, September, October, they shot down 140 some Jap planes, lost 14, and only had one pilot killed. And so I still say that's why the Japs never invaded Australia, was because the 49th with the 43rd Materiel Squadron keeping them flying discouraged the Japs from doing so. After a few months at Adelaide River, we moved further south to a new bomber base that the Aussies had built using the 808 engineer equipment. And it was a B-24 base, B-24 bombers, 4 engines, 4 1,250 horse engines, and so on. So, if I may, here's a shot of me sitting in my Jeep at Adelaide River. Shot taken by someone else, not me, in 1995 of our Adelaide, what was our Adelaide River airstrip. The only thing left is that pole with the windsock ring on it. The country we were in, semi-jungle, and there was termite everywhere, and this is a termite mound. And here's a sign that the Aussies have put up since the war, marking the B-24 bomber base called Fenton. Fenton was one of the many flying doctors that Arizona has used through the years, flying out of some of the bigger cattle stations. I think I should run those slides. This is a shot of inside the building and garden. This is a shot of the inside of the building and garden. And when the Japs hit, I think it was February 19th, 1942. They used the same task force that hit Pearl Harbor did, and they wiped out practically every building in the town. And the bottom end of the town was about 10,000 white people and 5,000 Malaysians and Chinese and so on.
Wow.
Steam engine built in Scotland in 1870 that ran on a narrow gauge line from Darwin down south about 100 miles. Next one. There's a 6x6 truck. We used to back them up and ram them into those, that's a big termite mound. And we'd ram them into the termite mound, and with whatever fell in the truck bed, we'd take it in, pound it into dirt, dust, then wet it, and we'd make a re-cemented floor in our tents. And the tents were 16-man pyramidal tents, but we never used them as such. We always only used put 4 men in the tent and raised the sides so that we widened the shaded area and make them cooler. There's a fruit bat that they'd fly out to the edge of the coast to feed all day and then fly back further inland at night. They were by the thousands everywhere. I was one of the squadron hunters. If we generals or politicians came up to Adelaide and later Fenton, I would take them out hunting. And but this case, I'm on the right. I shot the water buffalo and chopped the horns off with an axe. And the guy on the left is John Swinburne. He shot that wild boar laying in front of him. There's the famous DC-3s, or the Army Air Force called them the C-47s. That was lifeline for us. They brought in our groceries and supplies and all people back and forth from Brisbane or Townsville on the coast. And there's that second convoy I mentioned. I'm the one standing up in the cab, and the guy down in front, a little bit left, with the bandage on his head, he was Captain Ward of our leader that nearly killed himself on a horseback riding expedition. In the back, upper right, you can see some 2,000-gallon gasoline tankers that we took up 2 on the trip from Melbourne, and we took up, 4 or 5 on this trip from Brisbane back to Darwin. Me and another guy named Hallis, who later became the squadron photographer, we drove a so-called 5-ton autocar tractor pulling 2 2,000-gallon gasoline tankers, and behind it a 600-gallon water tank, for drinking water. And one of the guys remarked that that little water tank looked like an elephant, baby elephant following its mother. And way out in the desert after that one rain in 7 years, Hallis was driving, and we got stuck in the mud and he broke an axle. So we had a big, enormous wrecker with us. So the wrecker pulled the 2 tankers, and we pulled the water trailer behind us just using the front wheel drive since the rear wheel axle was broken. And this was a shot at Fenton in the dry season. In that country up there, it rained nearly every day for 6 months, and then never rained a drop for 6 months. This was the dry season, and the road going into the Fenton camp, the dust was about 6 inches deep. there's the Fenton camp, or one shot of it. There was small ant hills all through it. I think that was the mess hall, and off to the right would have been the kitchen. There's the joke U.S. Post Office. We got mail about once a month, but I can't read the distance there, but Los Angeles on one side and New York on the other. And the guy on the left is Gene Hallis, the guy that drove the rig from Brisbane to Adelaide River with me. And he got the job as squadron photographer. Many of these pictures were taken by him, and the rest of them were taken by me, since both of us had a Speedgraphic 4x5 camera, and since I was out at the airstrips all the time, I carried one with me to take photos of crashes and visitors and so on. There's beer call, and we finally got to Fenton. We had beer about once a month. This is also at Fenton, and the guy making the speech is our new CO. The previous one, Culbertson, was transferred down to Brisbane, and this guy is Major Muller. There's me sitting in the back of a so-called command car. I was trying to look like General Rommel in North Africa. There's a truck. We extended upward that bomb hoist on the back of that truck. We extended it up about 18 inches or maybe 2 feet so that we could home out in the bush, as the Aussies called it. And there was after the Darwin bombing, initial raid, the government made all the ranchers try to move all their cattle south and out of range in case the Japs invaded. And so, but they left a lot of them. So we would go out and shoot a steer once in a while, hoist him up and dress him and bring the meat into the cooks. Below the Fenton airstrip a few miles was a small river feeding into the much larger Victoria, and the Douglas River was the little one. And I built a fish trap and out of some chicken wire that I got from the Aussies, and I made a trap to try to catch some fish. Instead, all I caught was this alligator. And so that's my Jeep again. I think that's the gang that played softball all the time. And that's one of the crews, we call them. That the guy with the baseball cap on the bottom row was the chief, and they were the ones that would repair engines, airplanes. We had people that do sheet metal work, instrument repair work, and all the various jobs that needed to be done. There's the machine shop, which was set up out near the runway at Fenton. I think that tall building was where the parachute riggers, the territory during the dry season, wet season, everything was wet and dripping, so they had to take the parachutes apart quite often and dry them out and refold them. And one of those other sheds is the propeller repair shop. There's a crew working on an engine. The bombers, B-24s, had first had 1,250 horsepower radial engines. The last ones that the bomb group 380 got was 2,000 horse each. And radial engines like that one, they burned a lot more oil than inline engines like the ones that were in the P-40 fighter planes. I think that's the guy in the instrument repair shop, and I'm not sure. Because the Japs, every so often, well, they were kind of interesting. They either came at 12 noon daylight or 12 midnight to bomb us. And so to protect our tankers, we would dig pits that we could drive down into, as we'll show in a minute. And so that shows me sitting on the bulldozer that we dug the pits with. There's a tanker. We did that to make a lower profile so that when the Japs dropped bombs, the fragments would go over instead of into the tankers. And we built enormous revetments around each parking space on the airstrip to protect the B-24s the same way we dug these pits to protect the gasoline tankers. There's the bigger rig. That was an 808 Engineers bulldozer that they left with the Aussies, and they built those revetments around to protect the B-24s that were parked. There's a B-24 inner revetment. There's the control tower for the B-24 runway. That runway was built by the Aussies using the 808 equipment, bulldozers, and they built it originally 10,000 feet long and paved it with asphalt. And after the B-24s came and we overloaded them with gasoline and stuff, they extended it to 12,500 feet. And that was just a B-24, I don't know whether it was coming in or going out. But we could put 3,600 gallons of gasoline in them, and that would keep them in the air for 18 hours so they could make bombing runs to places in the Dutch East Indies, like Shell Oil Company's big refinery at Palembang in Borneo, and the big Jap naval base at Surabaya. There's another B-24 and another one behind them, so I guess that's getting ready for takeoff for the bombing range. There's a close-up of the B-24 being repaired. One of the co-pilots for that 380th Bomb Group flying these B-24s out over the Dutch East Indies was Jim Wright, who later became Speaker of the House of Representatives in the U.S. He was in Fort Worth. I don't remember seeing him or meeting him, but I learned later when they had a reunion that was the case. Nearly all the planes had the pilot's girlfriend's name on it. This one just said Juarez Whistle. There's a B-25. The Americans up in the northern territory, we didn't have any, but the Americans had furnished the Dutch with a bunch of them, twin engine, and they had a base below Fenton. And one day, all the pilots for the Dutch outfit were old KLM civilian airline pilots that flew from Holland to Java, Dutch East Indies, and before the war. And so they were good pilots. But one day one of them landed, and I drove out in the Jeep to ask what was wrong. He said he'd been on a run out over the Dutch East Indies. Coming back, he was afraid he couldn't make it down to their base at Catherine. So I filled him, I didn't fill him up, but I think I gave him 1,000 gallons of gasoline. He wanted to know what he had to sign for it. And I said, you're on our side, aren't you? So it's on the house. And so later I took him in to get our spare parts people to order parts for him since the Dutch couldn't get any. And as a result of that, he gave me a ride in his B-25. So that was the only time I was ever in one. And up at Fenton, or up at Adelaide River, I won't tell you how, but we ended up with a little twin double-wing little biplane. It had fabric, and it had been built, I guess, about 1930, 35. And the engine wouldn't run, and so we took it down to Adelaide River, our repair base, and the guys rebuilt it. And there's even one of them knew how to put fabric on it. So we had a little toy to play with and a morale builder. So we had a sergeant that said he could fly. So he flew the thing, and he was teaching me to fly. When our major, Culbertson, found out about what was going on, so he came out and took over. And I didn't get to fly much after that, but Culbertson learned to fly, and so he claimed it. And so when we moved to Fenton, I don't know why, but he gave that one to the Dutchman down below, and they gave him this CW Curtiss-Wright 22 little fighter plane with all Dutch labels on the instruments and so on. And so he finally learned Madison, the sergeant, taught him to fly this thing. And that's a de Havilland D-4 plane run by the Aussies. And I think that's the one that had the 4 engines. And in the middle of the floor, which was plywood, the outside of that plane was covered with fabric. But inside, there was a hole about 18 inches square, broke, and the Aussies just flew it that way. And it was used to haul the stuff you see here, very loading. When there was a crash way over on the coast, called the Shady Lady, or the B-24, we got this plane with all the other things, because it could land on the beach where the B-24 was. And it hauled enough gasoline in 5-gallon cans to let the B-24 take off after our people repaired it. And there's that B-24 that landed on that beach. When it landed, coming back from a raid over the Indies, the front nose wheel broke through the sand and salt crust on the beach. And so our guys went up and rebuilt the front end of it and bolted the nose wheel stiff and put a fabric covered nose on it, took out the twin 50 caliber machine guns were in a nose turret. And here's the crew that repaired it, plus a bunch of avos pushing it to get it in position to take off when it was repaired. There's that plane, a better shot of it, showing the word Shady Lady. And you can see the fabric on the front. The front is on a frame that we just put on when they took the nose turret off. And the nearest we could get a plane to land that frame, which was aluminum, was about 20 miles from this beach. And so I went over one day with a guy that was head of engineering, and the nearest civilization, I think, to this was called, I can't remember the name of it, but it was run by 2 Spanish priests. And so we got them to round up enough avos to carry that front frame about 20 miles. And the place there they were at was called Drysdale Mission. There was 2 buildings, and the Abos came and went as they pleased. And we paid the Abos that carried that. We gave them a twist of tobacco a day and a cup of flour a day for each man. Because the priest said if we paid them any more, then they couldn't afford to get them to come and do any work for them. This recovery, Hallis went over later and took these pictures, and he had a whole series of them, and he sent them to, of course, among other things, to headquarters in Brisbane. They let the Army magazine publish them, except they smeared them a little bit to make it look like they were artists who drew the pictures instead of photos. As a result of that article in the magazine, later Newsweek published a similar story on the recovery of this plane. As a result, the Japs was reading those magazines too. Don't ask me how, but no doubt. They bombed those 2 buildings and killed the priests that tried to get on mission. So it had a bad ending. But they flew from here, from the beach. Those Abos helped us cut down the salt and sand knobs and bushes and so on the beach so it had a longer run we could take off. And we skipped everything in there we could take loose and throw away. So it'd be light enough to take off. We flew it to Fenton, and they flew it to Brisbane. And I understood that later they shipped it to Wright Air Force Base in Ohio for a museum type. Okay. There's a hole in the dry season made near, this was only about 200 or 300 yards from my tent. And it's about 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep. And that was a single 500 kg, that's about 1,100 pound Jap bomb. And so when that landed, I was in a slit trench between this and my tent, and a bunch of us in there. That dirt had a lot of little rocks in it. And when the cat got through, my cheeks were both bleeding, and I couldn't hear because so that was the first time I applied for a Purple Heart. But they wouldn't give me one because no officer was present to witness my injury. So for 3 or 4 days I couldn't hardly hear it at all because the concussion was severe. Okay. The Japs got lucky and hit one of our B-24s, and parked next to it was the Major's little Dutch airplane, and next to it was a 2,000-gallon gasoline tanker that was filling the B-24. So that was the only gasoline tanker I lost, and that was the only B-24 that ever got hit by a bomb at Fenton. And the Major, he was unhappy about losing his airplane. And that's all that was left of the mess after it burned. You can see the revetment behind it. They got a direct hit. I hate to say it, but I think the direct hit was on my gasoline tanker. And then it, of course, would have burned the planes on either side of it. Those rounded tanks in the foreground are oxygen tanks. The 43rd had our own oxygen making plant, and we could fill those bottles. There's that burned tanker that caused the trouble. And that same raid over near the machine shop that we saw earlier, a piece of shrapnel went into the crankcase of this huge diesel engine, and that guy's left hand is near the hole. And our guys welded, or didn't weld, brazed, is a better word, a patch over that hole, and took the crankcase out and got the scrap iron out of it and put it back to work. I believe this was the engine that was used to run the oxygen plant. here's the a fuel dump. We were getting stuck in the mud a lot because when I first set up the fuel system at Fenton, we only put 20 or 30 barrels, 55-gallon drums, in one spot in case they got hit. But we had a new captain, and he insisted that we put everything in one spot. So as soon as we did, the Japs bombed it and burned about half of the barrels. And a lot of them were saved by a guy named Tommy Tompkins. And he, on that little bulldozer that I was pictured on earlier, he pushed a lot of the barrels out of the way while the others were burning and exploding. And when 55 gallons of gasoline gets hot enough in the middle of a fire, the whole thing will go up as a balloon getting bigger. When it gets about 100 feet high and enough oxygen, it will explode. And it looks like a little atomic bomb, although at that time I'd never heard of an atomic bomb. There's a Jap recon that came over one day, and I don't think he dropped any bombs, but he was sailing over, and the Aussies had a B-24 twin-engine fighter plane, the only twin-engine fighter plane I ever saw, well, except B-38s. But they chased him down and shot him down near Fenton, and when I rushed out, see, the pilot and co-pilot had been killed, and so this is all that was left. Early one morning, I always went out to see what was going on at the airstrip at Fenton. And this B-24 landed, but it didn't have any guns sticking out. And it had these 5 U.S. senators on it. And so the left one is Hap Chandler. He was governor of Kentucky when I met him in McLeansboro, Illinois, about 1936, at a political rally. The next one from the left is Brewster, Senator Brewster of Maine. The next one is Henry Cabot Lodge, Senator of Massachusetts. The next is Senator Ball of Georgia. The next one is the B-24 converted B-24 captain. And the guy on the right is Jim Meade, New York Senator. So it was just barely daylight out there. I took that picture of the Speed Graphic 405. So since there wasn't anybody else around, I offered to haul them in for breakfast. And so Cabot Lodge said, "We can't all ride in that Jeep." And Hap Chandler said, "Oh, come on, I saw a picture the other day of a Jeep in Europe, and there was 12 guys, and set a record." So they gave Cabot Lodge the front seat, and the rest of them hung out, sat with their feet hanging out. So I drove 5 U.S. senators about a mile from the airstrip I took him to the 380 bomb headquarters, because they had a colonel, and our CO was only a major. So I took him in. And the colonel was still in bed when I woke him up. Here's a picture taken by Hallis when they were leaving. They just spent one night with us. And that's Jim Meade on the right, the New York Senator. I'm in the middle with the silly cap on. Hap Chandler there is second from the left. The other 2 guys worked for me. And that B-24, they had converted it to a sleeper plane. They had little compartments, and so each of these senators needed to sleep in it if you wanted to. And to get to Fenton, they flew about 3,500 miles from Ceylon non-stop. That was the longest flight I'd ever heard of up to that time. I'd like to add one more thing about the 380th Bomb Group. They lost about 2/3 of their planes and people in the first 6 months they operated out over the Dutch East Indies without any fighter protection. From Fenton, we were relieved and went to Amberley Field in Brisbane. We no sooner got there than I was ordered to join the Army Engineers in New Guinea. And because of my experience with National Tank Company. And so at big depot at Milne Bay, I taught Army Engineer platoons how to build bolted steel tanks and hook them up and run lines to the air bases up and down New Guinea and other islands. The biggest installment we built was at Tobadura, where they used 250,000 gallons of aviation gasoline a day. From the engineers, I finally got orders to go to flying school again. And I came back to the States when I got to Biloxi, Mississippi, Keesler Field. They gave me orders to go to pre-flight school, and then a day or two later, before I left, they canceled them, said I was too old. So from there I went out to San Bernardino Air Base, ran the refueling one summer, and things were dull in the U.S., I thought, even though I went to Hollywood every weekend, every Friday night. Things were dull, so I found out how to go to Europe as a tourist. And so I joined the AACS, the Army Airways Communication System, and I went to Britain from by way of Selfridge Field in Michigan, where I met my future wife, Carol Booth. And we rode a Liberty ship in a huge convoy from New York to Southampton. And we sunk a Jap sub on the way. I mean a German sub, the destroyer escorts and the Canadian airplanes, a little flat top. They sunk a Nazi sub, they said, as we were approaching Ireland. I was assigned in AACS to the Valley Air Base out on the Isle of Anglesey. And on VE Day, I was in London. I saw Churchill for the first time, and he made a speech from Eisenhower's hotel balcony in which he said, now that we have vanquished Nazism, we should turn around and vanquish communism. And that got him defeated in the next election. Like all 5 senators I referred to, every one of them was defeated in the next election. So I came back to the States thinking that we might have to go to Japan again. And I came back on the Liberty ship to New York, to Camp Atterbury in Indiana, where I was discharged.
Leo, I want to thank you so much for everything you did for our country and our people. And I want to thank you so much for being willing to spend time with us and share all of your memories. Just thank you so much for helping preserve those memories for us. And in our last little minute, say what it was like in England at the end of the war.
Well, when we weren't supposed to know, we weren't supposed to be in London, but the sergeant that ran our cryptography section the day before VE Day told me that VE Day was coming up in a day or two. So since I handled all the passes for the outfit, he and I went to London. That's the reason we were there at VE Day, and got the chance to see Churchill. But I've often said and thought, if
Go ahead, finish your statement.
That if there was as much sadness and bitterness in Berlin as there was joy and jubilation and happiness in London on VE Day. I sure was glad I wasn't in